Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elected representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Jeff Dubrow.
And welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here. I'm Jeff Dubrow, and today's topic, very much self-explanatory when it comes to the title, which is Canada fiddling while global democracy burns? Is Canada doing enough to stem the tide of democratic backsliding? That is the reduction in the quality and quantity of democracies around the world. My guest today to discuss this issue, Tom Cormier, the President and CEO of the Parliamentary Centre in Ottawa, Canada. Tom, welcome to Politics and Public Finance.
Jeff, it's a pleasure to be with you.
So glad you could make it. How's your summer going so far?
It's been great. I just came back from 2 weeks near lakes, and that's always a great place to decompress and to enjoy the summer. So back at it, and looking forward to today's discussion.
Nice to hear. And I'll say on a personal note that I lived in Ottawa for 20 years, and I'm here in Moncton, New Brunswick now, living here. But I have a lot of affection for Ottawa, but what I do not miss is those incredibly hot, humid summers.
It gets humid, but we deal with it no problem.
By going to the lake.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. Tom, let's start with the elevator pitch. Maybe you can briefly introduce, for those of our listeners who haven't heard about the Parliamentary Centre, tell us about it.
Absolutely. The Parliamentary Centre is Canada's global leader for democracy. We were established in 1967 to support our own parliament at a time when our parliament didn't have the research support it required to deal with pressing issues, particularly at the global level. So the Parliamentary Centre essentially was formed as a research support to the External Affairs Committee of the day. And over the years, after providing great support to our own parliament as it strengthened its capacity, its research and support to its committees and to members, the Parliamentary Centre turned its efforts internationally. And since then, we've worked in over 70 countries and over 170 legislatures to really share experiences about how to ensure that institutions of democracy, legislatures, political parties, legislators, civil society organizations can work together to make sure democracy delivers tangible results to citizens.
I'm going to make a wild guess and say that's not your first time delivering that elevator pitch. You're pretty
Not at all, and it's something I'm really proud to be able to do, to work for a Canadian organization and to provide leadership. I've worked in this sector over 20 years internationally, and preceding that 10 years working on Parliament Hill in a political role. Legislatures and democracy are pretty much my life and my passion. So always happy to talk about what we do.
That's why you're a guest on the podcast. And I'll say, it's amazing. It's kind of an honor to say that I was myself worked at the Parliamentary Centre from
Absolutely.
1999 to 2004, many moons ago. How has the Centre changed over the years?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, we originally were started to serve our own parliament.
Yeah.
And it's something we reflect on a lot because we acknowledge that every parliament needs to constantly improve the way it does its work and can always benefit from advice and strengthening. So over the years, certainly we focused more internationally, although we do still engage domestically, and we can talk about that a little later. What the Parliamentary Centre has done over the years is it's focused on strengthening parliaments, and that remains our center of gravity. But we also find ourselves working with civil society organizations to bring them into the discussion. We also work a lot on inclusivity to make sure parliaments are a place where the different voices inherent in every society can come together and participate in meaningful discussions and dialogues and debates on the issues affecting the country, but do so in an organized way, in a way that respects the rules. So over the years, we find ourselves working on policy issues that are important to the countries in which we work. Sometimes it's natural resources, sometimes it's food security, sometimes it could be education or child maternal health. We recognize that every single development challenge in the world has a governance challenge that's associated with it. And we believe that stronger legislatures that are more able to review and look into these challenges and strengthen legislation, strengthen oversight, strengthen the budgetary process. Parliaments are a key institution in solving and addressing these development challenges for long-term sustainability.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. When I think back to the time that I was at the center, 1999 to 2004, and I was leading the work in the sort of democratic development work in Russia. Oops, that didn't quite work out, despite the best efforts of the center. But it's so interesting, Tom, because at that point, democracy was on the ascendancy, and the Soviet Union had collapsed only 10 years before. And there was a sense that, it was about expanding democracy. Now democracy seems to be on the retreat. So you've got a pretty tough job. How concerned are you about democratic backsliding, both in terms of the quality of democracies around the world and the quantity of democracies around the world?
The short answer is very concerned, and we'll get into that. I will underline the irony of this. I started my international work in Ukraine in 1999. So I
didn't realize that, actually.
As well, looking back at the challenges that were present in 1999, I was there for 3 years and have kept up and kept engaged with Ukraine over the years. But certainly Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is a wake-up call for all of us. And a lot has been made about the fact that Ukraine has been waging a very valiant and inspirational battle against Russia for their very sovereignty, but also for their democracy. And a lot of attention has been placed on the fact that Ukraine's democratic path really irks Russia. And it's something that I think we, as leading democracies around the world, need to come together on to make sure that democracy and Ukraine prevail in this battle, because it really is a moment in time when we have to put our money where our mouth is and to defend those values that we hold sacred with respect to democracy and human rights. And I think it's a really important time for Canada to be present and supporting Ukraine and other countries that are facing challenges with respect to eroding civil society space, the challenges of COVID, where some governments have constrained public dissent and have used COVID as an opportunity to essentially undermine legislatures, sometimes electoral systems. And it's something we ought to be very concerned about. And it's something we're doing work on as a Parliamentary Centre.
Absolutely, Tom. And I'll just take a moment to say that I am a strong, unequivocal supporter of Ukraine and Ukrainian independence. I had the honor of living in Kiev in 1994 for 6 months. I was 24 years old, and I had just finished my bachelor degree. Did a fair amount of work there afterwards for a number of years. There are no two sides to the story. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was completely illegal and unprovoked, and I couldn't agree more with you on that. Before we get more onto the backsliding issue, since you mentioned Ukraine, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, the center has done something very interesting since the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is that you've provided access to Ukrainian MPs, you've provided Canadians with access to Ukrainian MPs to talk a bit about what they're going through. Do you want to share a little bit of that? Because I think that's really an exceptional effort that you've made on that front.
Sure. We've been active in Ukraine over the years, and currently, before the invasion took place, we were working actively in the Parliament of Ukraine to provide support to committees that oversee the security sector, the police and army, but also the committee that is tasked with advancing European integration. And what we were doing was providing support to committees to better exercise civilian oversight and to make sure that they're in step with democratic values that are essential with respect to good management of Parliament, ensuring the voices of diverse voices are heard in the process, particularly those of women. And so once the invasion happened, we were able to pivot our support and really make sure that the Parliament could still function under very, very difficult circumstances.
Incredibly difficult.
And I think the Parliament of Ukraine, as well as, is an example of how Ukraine has really stood up to this challenge and has insisted that democratic institutions must still function. The Parliament is now it is still deliberating on laws. It's passing legislation. We are providing some support to the staff members who are preparing reviews of draft legislation. But we're also, as you mentioned, connecting Ukrainian parliamentarians with Canadian audiences, primarily the Canada-Ukraine Friendship Group in our parliament, to make sure our parliamentarians have firsthand access to the realities faced by their counterparts in Ukraine. But also we're providing access for these MPs to tell their stories to Canadians via the media, the Canadian media, but also international media. And we're also connecting them to their peers in other countries. Some of those countries have been wavering in their support, or particularly at the United Nations. And Ukrainian MPs want to be able to access their peers directly to tell them what's going on, to underscore the importance of the survival of Ukraine's democracy under this illegal invasion. And it's something that we are very proud of doing. And we're extremely inspired by not only the parliamentarians that participate in our programs, but also a civil society organization called the Agency for Legislative Initiatives, which has a long track record of over 20 years of supporting the development of parliament in Ukraine. And we're very proud to have a strong local partner to help us deliver this program funded by Global Affairs Canada.
Yeah, I think it's quite remarkable, and I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast. But I find one of the things, I mean, I think it's important to note that of course, Ukrainian democracy is far from perfect. It's a very difficult state to govern at the best of times. There are high rates of corruption, et cetera, et cetera. Because I don't think we should sugarcoat the situation, but it is a democracy. And what I find quite amazing actually is that, if you look at the situation in Russia, you really have one person doing all the talking on behalf of the country. Name one parliamentarian in Russia. It's not really possible, is it? But yet you have these voices, women and men, because if you look at the Russian cabinet, it's all men sitting around a table. I think there's one woman who's at the around. Well, so they're not at a table; they're actually sitting in chairs in the background while they watch.
Very far away from Mr.
What? Absolutely, but I think it's amazing that you have these parliamentarians that are vocal. Again, a large quantity of women and men who are speaking out about their country, and I think that in itself speaks volumes to the difference between the two countries. Not sure if you want to respond to that or.
Sure, absolutely, and I would say what's really been interesting for us is the parliamentarians that have participated in our program. This international engagement and media advocacy have mostly been women, partly because they're able to travel more freely, because men are under some restrictions in terms of travel.
Yes, of course.
And so we have been absolutely pleased with the quality and the conciseness that these female legislators have brought to the table. They are absolutely in lockstep, even though they're from different parties, with the need for unity in this moment, obviously in the defense of their territorial integrity, but also in defense of their democracy. And I think it's really inspirational for everyone to look at how Ukrainians have come together, put aside partisan differences, to really capture this moment in time where Ukraine has an opportunity to really push back against the authoritarian option offered by Russia and to move its way towards Euro-Atlantic integration, where democracy, the rule of law, respect for human rights is front and center, and the opportunities that flow from that in terms of economic well-being and prosperity are clear. Ukrainians have made that choice, and their legislators are speaking in unison to the world that choice is worth protecting.
So let's talk a bit about what Canada is doing to stem the tide of democratic backsliding around the world. And before we start that, I think it's important to acknowledge that throughout my career, I've always noticed, of course, and as you have, Tom, that many of the foreign international organizations, even the American National Democratic Institute for I guess just the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, is often staffed abroad by Canadians. So I think Canadians do have a significant role to play. However, I think also I noticed when I was working, not only with the center but with other Canadian NGOs, that often the fact that they have there's a heavy emphasis on project management, right? I mean, you're getting project funding to do a particular project, you're providing reports, that sometimes organizations are so busy doing this work that they don't necessarily have the time to communicate, to advocate for their core vision and cause, which is in your case, democracy. All that to say, how good a job do you think Canada's doing currently? And that's not just the government, that's the government, the NGO community, etc., in advocating for democracy abroad and in helping to stem the tide against democratic backsliding.
Okay. I'll start by saying, look, I am one of those Canadians who worked proudly for NDI. I started my career there. I spent about 13 years working in a variety of places for them, as well as for other international organizations, the Westminster Foundation, Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, International IDEA, the OSCE. So there's no shortage of Canadians working in this space. The challenge for Canada is that most of them are working for foreign organizations. On the flip side, there are repeated and clear commitments, both a demand from the Parliament of Canada numerous times, the last time being in 2019, an all-party consensus report saying Canada should develop a coherent democracy policy. It should be at the center of foreign and development policy, but also that it should create a new democracy center. The Prime Minister's mandate letters to Minister Sajjan and Minister Joly are clear. He has asked them to prioritize the increase in the availability of Canadian support for democracy and for aspiring Democrats around the world. He has asked them to advance the creation of a new democracy center. And so I think we're really excited by these commitments. And so, but in achieving progress here will require some change in the way global affairs manages its priorities, but also it will require, I think, a clearer commitment from our political leaders as well, from all parties, that this is a place Canada needs to be present. It's an important opportunity for Canadian leadership at the global level, and it's something that unites Canadians of all political backgrounds. That the support of democracy and the support to aspiring Democrats is something that is central to Canadian identity and Canadian values. So we're working with Global Affairs as a strong Canadian partner. We are the only Canadian organization that is focused on democratic development and the development of inclusive institutions. And so we really want to be we want to play a leading role in Canada's advancement of democratic development because it's been lagging in recent years. That's what all of the research points to.
Okay, so here's a little anecdote for you. I remember when I was traveling to Eastern Europe, I'd fly back from Russia or Ukraine or the Balkans. And, eventually I'd get to Frankfurt or Vienna or London, and I'd hop on an Air Canada flight. And one of my favorite parts was putting on the Canadian news, which of course I would have missed over the last couple of the weeks that I was away or months that I was away. But I found that Canadian news is often like a soap opera. You could turn it off for 6 months and turn it back on, and the story is almost the same. The storyline is the same. I find that's the case a little bit with regard to what we're talking about, because you mentioned that 2019 Standing Committee report on foreign affairs, but there was also a Standing Committee report from 2007 on advancing Canada's role in international support for democratic development. Numerous organizations such as IRPP have written papers on the subject. In fact, it was even in a throne speech from the previous government. So what's going on here? Why is it taking so long to develop this coherent approach?
What I think, I would agree with you. There's been a strong and consistent and unified demand from the Parliament of Canada to the government to do more in this sector. If we look around the world, whether we take the example of the United States, that's been quite a global leader on democracy support over the last 30 years, Westminster Foundation in the UK, and other similar organizations in Germany and in other countries of Europe, these efforts are all underpinned by a strong multi-party consensus. That consensus exists, and it needs to be front and center in delivering on this vision. My sense as well is we are working in the similar sector in that we work in political spaces, although we do so in a nonpartisan way. We are there for the process, not for particular political outcomes.
Mhm.
So it's delicate, the work we do, and we have to do this work with a lot of balance and a lot of care to make sure that we're not seen as favoring one group of political group over another. And so it's something that governments cannot do this work. It needs to be done by a third party, an independent organization that is professional and that manages risk appropriately. And so it's something that we're prepared to do. We have demonstrated a strong track record over the years of doing just that in over 70 countries. But what I think we need to make sure that, when Global Affairs is providing support to various development initiatives around the world, we are really pushing them to pay more attention to the challenges of getting governance right as a very, very important solution, a very important aspect of making sure that there's durable development and there's sustainable solutions to some of these challenges. FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, we feel has been very transformative in the way Global Affairs does its work. Previously, you will recall that development projects always had a gender element to them, but oftentimes, people were ticking boxes and we're not really taking it seriously. We're looking at numbers. What Global Affairs has done is, through FIAP, really provided a platform for transitional programming that looks at inclusivity in a very holistic way. And so what we're saying is, in FIAP, in action item number 5 on governance, it's very clear. The Government of Canada, Global Affairs recognizes that there are barriers, historic barriers and practical barriers to the advancement of women in decision-making positions. We want to address these. We want to work with Global Affairs to make sure that these barriers are addressed and removed, so that not only do we have more women in decision-making roles, but that the institutions they work in are better, that they're better workplaces than they have been traditionally. Most legislatures were never designed for women to participate, even our own. If you look at some of the practical challenges that in many legislatures, there are not enough women's washrooms, or they're too far away from the chamber, and some of the male ones have been converted. Practical things like that, but also that the sitting hours of legislatures were not designed for people with family responsibilities, but also the data that legislatures look at to make decisions and to analyze things have not been gender disaggregated. So there's lots of practical things we can do to change the legislatures as a workplace, to make sure that when new people arrive, whether they be women who have been excluded for long periods, or other equity-seeking groups, the workplace is a better one. It embraces the diversity and it welcomes outside voices, and that takes changing rules of procedure, changing access to information, changing the way Parliament presents itself in public, to make sure that the society knows that Parliament is a place of where the multitude of voices come together and make important decisions. So that's what we're all about, and we think that there's a really exciting opportunity for Canada to share not only our own experience at the federal level, but also provincial and territorial levels, but also to provide experience sharing among developing democracies about what works and also importantly what doesn't work, in terms of making sure that legislatures are more inclusive places for the business of the people to be undertaken.
Absolutely. And just to go back to clarify something you said earlier, so when you're talking about making Parliament a more inclusive place for women, absolutely there is that sort of internal inclusivity issue, but there's also the overall issue about strengthening democratic traditions and processes. I think we should spend a bit of time on that topic, because I think I think it's important. I don't think we're doing, when I say we, I don't necessarily mean you and I just mean in general. I don't think there's a lot of people arguing about why it's important to be a democracy. You and I know in our core being why it's important to be a democracy. But I don't necessarily know that we're making the case in countries. And I think that's important. And I think we should maybe talk a bit about why it's important to be a democracy. I'll just start by saying that one of the issues I'd like to have discussed on this podcast is the areas related to corruption and autocracy, whether autocratic states tend to have higher levels of corruption because there's less checks and balances built into the system. Do you have any sort of, how would you argue for democracy? And are you at the stage where you're sort of doing that globally?
Sure. I mean, look at we are in lockstep in believing that democracies really are the best way towards prosperity and a better life for people. It is important, I think, to ensure that decisions are made that benefit when they benefit from the input of people who are affected, and that takes an open legislature, but it also takes talking with, if it's an issue on agriculture, making sure farmers are at the table, but also farm supply companies or international people involved in international trade if there's export involved. So really making sure that decisions are made with more people around the table, because when we limit access to decision making, people do make decisions in terms of what's in their best interest. And we want to make sure that new people are around the table that are bringing fresh ideas and fresh perspectives, but also lived experience that can unlock some of the challenges that have been generational in some cases, that are holding countries back from their economic potential, and keeping children less educated than they ought to be, keeping people less healthy, not as healthy as they ought to be, because government isn't delivering services to people, partly because government revenues are being captured by those people in small groups who are in it for themselves. We want to break that open, and we want to make sure that new people with new ideas are around the table. And so I think that's something that we're really that is central to all of our work. I think it's important that we mention the challenges, I think, associated with media and how it's changed over the years, particularly the rise of social media. We know that in our own societies, social media can be a source of good, but it also can be a source of division, and it can really exacerbate divisions in society. We've certainly seen that in the United States. We see it somewhat here in Canada, but in countries with weaker democratic institutions, weaker traditional media, or media that may be controlled by political interests, the effects are even more stark. And so we have social media playing a really disturbing role in advancing the interests of autocrats. In some cases as well, there's very gendered disinformation that is keeping women from wanting to be involved in politics, because doing so opens them up to both real acts of violence against them or threats, and it is inciting people to promote hate speech, and that's something that we really are concerned about, and we think it's something we can do together, because in essence we are sharing some of these challenges in real time, both in advanced democracies and those aspiring to become more democratic countries.
Absolutely, and you've really touched on was going to be my second point on this, which is that I think going back to my sort of 1999 benchmark, if you want to call it that, when I sort of started my career working on this issue on democratization. We weren't looking at the quality of our own democracy. It was a bit more enthusiastic. We sort of had something to sell, right? And Canadians are pretty modest at that, but nonetheless, it was really about, okay, communist world, you have now become democracy. Maybe if you want to be democracies, we're going to help you achieve that. Now we're seeing the decline in our own democracies, certainly in the United States. And episode 12 of the podcast was all about democratic backsliding and the decline of women's rights. But we're also seeing indications of that in Canada, and we've had several podcasts on that too, on the trucker protests. So the center works internationally now, and I didn't mean to necessarily make this question about the center, but I think we have to. The question is, how do we start to shore up our own democracy? and not necessarily work on democratic development internationally exclusively. So two-part question. One, what do you think? Two, what does the Centre think?
Sure.
Or are they divisible?
Yeah, the Centre certainly works in Canada. We have a very interesting program that we are running in partnership with Carleton University that's supported by the private sector called Engage Parl Diplo. And it's a space where we bring diplomats posted in Canada together with legislators in the House of Commons and Senate to talk about policy issues that are important to Canada's global position, but also we provide orientation programming for new MPs after every election and new arriving diplomats every year on Canada's democratic institutions, how they function, how they interact with each other, to get a deeper sense of what makes Canada tick democratically. But I would agree that since I started work internationally in 1999, I'm always very careful to remind those that we're working with that there is no perfect democracy. It's not a destination, it's a process. There's always need for improvement, but that's also one of the attractive features of democracy. It's not done, and it's in constant need of nourishing and renewal. And I've been more or less out of Canada over the last 20 years, working in a variety of different democracies, countries in transition to democracy. Coming home, yes, I realize that our country has to do more to make sure that citizens participate. We had an election recently in Ontario, which a lot of people drew attention to the very low turnout as a wake-up call that more civic education, more encouragement of people to vote is important. And I note that there are Canadian organizations that are dedicated to encouraging both young people and marginalized people to understand the importance of democratic institutions. I think of Apathy is Boring, based in Montreal. There's also Samara Canada that's looking at the way Parliament is functioning to try to translate that to wider audiences so people can understand the value of our democratic institutions, but also the importance that they will not continue to work effectively unless people participate. So I'm really happy that we can continue to share this experience with and have it inspire our work internationally. One of the reasons that I wanted to come back home to Canada to lead the organization as well is because in my travels, I've certainly never seen another country other than Canada that is so welcoming of newly arrived people into the political process. We have a very diverse democracy. We have an accessible democracy. And, we have people that are that come to Canada as refugees and get themselves elected to office at all levels. And I think that's a real badge of honor for Canada. And it's something we need to understand more about to tap into the experiences of these people who themselves have sought a better life in a democratic space and have become democratic actors in their own right. So I think there's a lot of potential for Canada to engage with these people, to be advocates for why democracy matters, why it's important for the prosperity in society.
Yeah, interesting. We should wrap up in a couple of minutes, but let's just put out one more issue or question or continue the discussion a little bit. What I found interesting recently and listening to a number of podcasts is that the United States has a very flawed electoral system. That's not exactly breaking news. And that system was tested on January 6th of 2020, right? Was it 2020? Terrible at dates. Yeah, 2020, during the most recent presidential election in the U.S. And they're actually talking about making some modifications to the electoral system. For example, to be very clear, that the vice president is only there to preside over a process of certification, but actually doesn't have any authority to reverse certification of votes in the U.S. The reason I raise this is that there are a number of flaws in our system. We have seen in Canada, the prorogation crisis of 2008. There are a number of examples. I would say the electoral system itself, which really allows for a two-party system in terms of the parties that govern in Canada. What do we need to do to make this to make sure that we start to address some of the what I will call self-styled flaws in the democratic system in Canada?
Yeah. Look, I can only repeat that I think democracy is something that needs constant attention. It should always be evolving. There have been some advancements in Canada in terms of the role of parliamentarians in managing the sort of leadership in parties, but also there have been attempts to change the electoral system. It was interesting for me. I was out of the country at the time and watched it from afar. But having been in countries that are really struggling with with the effects of electoral systems in divided societies, for instance, electoral systems really have a direct impact on the makeup of legislatures. And in some societies, that can lead to increased conflict, and it can lead to exclusion of important voices. It's a topic that requires a lot of thought, and it requires a lot of engagement among civil society as well as politicians. Obviously, it's not something we leave to politicians. It's something that needs to involve a really good, robust, informed dialogue with many voices. I read about the efforts in British Columbia to try to reform the electoral system by appointing a committee of citizens. I think that's an interesting model to look at, and because it really brought people into the system that otherwise wouldn't have had a voice, and it provided information and supported their journey to understand different options for electoral reform. Electoral reform is very complicated. In many countries, it takes years, and it requires a really informed discussion. Can't be done quickly, and it certainly shouldn't be done by politicians alone.
Let's leave it there, Tom. That was a great conversation. I hope we'll do it again soon. Tom Cormier, the president and CEO of the Parliamentary Centre based in Ottawa. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Super conversation with Tom Cormier, president and CEO of the Parliamentary Centre. There is no doubt that this man is passionate and dedicated to the work that he does in this field. It was really interesting also, and inspiring, in fact, to hear about the work the Centre is doing to support the Parliament of Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada, as it's known, which has continued its work while its country is under Russian invasion. Can you imagine how difficult and stressful that has to be for the Parliament? So interesting to hear the innovative ways in which the Parliamentary Centre has continued to support the Rada during the Russian invasion. That is our podcast for today. Politics and Public Finance is produced and sponsored by Huge Impact Marketing. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, be sure to subscribe. I'm Jeff Dubrow. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.